Story 1. I live near Lincoln, Illinois. Lincoln is pretty centrally located in central Illinois. It is 30 miles from the state capital, Springfield, 35 miles each from Bloomington Normal, Peoria, and Decatur. It has a population of about 12,000. I am now 50 years old, but when I was a little boy of 3 to 4, me and my family had an encounter with a Salt Creek monster. If you live in central Illinois, that is pronounced crick, not creek. At that time we lived out in the country, less than a quarter of a mile from Salt Creek. This was 2 miles outside an extremely small little village, Kenny, Illinois. My mother witnessed it cross the road right before the bridge that crossed Salt Creek. My brothers had been down there night fishing and placing out night lines. My mum drove down to the bridge to get the boys and tell them to get back up to the house. It was almost 10 p.m, and they weren't going to be allowed to stay out there all night. One of my brothers told my mum they had seen Bigfoot. Her not believing them told them, "Well, you two boys get in the car and come on home." They told her they had to gather their fishing poles and gear, and to please wait while they got it, and they would walk back up to the house. She agreed and waited while they did that, and they started back down the road. One of my brothers was on foot, and one was on his bike. As they took off, she drove on toward a bridge to turn around on a little gravel drive right before the bridge. She had her driver's side window down. As she got to the drive, a horrible smell of garbage mixed with rotten sewage water practically smacked her in the face through the window. In the headlights, a 6-foot-tall man-shaped thing crossed in the headlights from one side of the road to the other. It was light grey and completely hair-covered. It looked directly at the car as it passed by. She said she'll never forget those glowing yellow eyes. She said the hair on her arms, neck and head all stood on end, and she's never felt that scared since. She turned into the drive on the right side of the road and slammed the gear shift into reverse, quickly doing a 3-point turn to go back away from the bridge and back up to the road to the house. As she went toward the house, this thing was running down the road. The boys had been looking back as they went to see where Mum was, and they saw this huge, muscular man-shaped thing running in their direction. They later said they looked back because this thing must have weighed a lot, because they felt it running on the paved country road before they saw it. My brother was on his foot, was scared so bad, he passed my other brother on his bicycle running. Mum was freaked out because it looked like it was going after the boys. She swerved over at the creature and it jumped off the right side of the road down 15 feet into the deep ditch and let out a blood-curdling scream. Everyone got back up to the house and quickly got in, and they locked all the doors and windows. They later said they could hear it walking around the house. It was thudding into the ground and breathing loudly as it went by the windows. My sister and her best friend were sleeping out in a camper that fit into the bed of a pickup truck. They heard something walk up to the camper and circle it 5 or 6 times. They could hear deep, heavy breathing, and the dog that was scared of nothing was under the truck whining. This thing slapped the side of the camper and rattled the doorknob. The 2 girls stayed completely still and even held their breath. They were trying to be so quiet. After what seemed like forever, but in reality was probably 30 to 40 seconds, they finally heard whatever it was, and they never looked out the window to see, thud off in the direction of Salt Creek. Some time later they heard something off in the distance. In the same direction, they heard the thing that only moments before had been circling their camper. Story 2. So back in 2007, I was 8 years old. Me and my grandparents lived up on a mountain in northern Georgia in Floyd County, and our property was against the Bartow County line. It's a warm September night, just a couple of days after my birthday. I'm up in my room playing Call of Duty on my Wii, and my grandpa walks in and asks if I can take the trash out before it gets too cold. I say sure, and pause my game and slip my shoes on. I walk out into the garage and open the garage door to throw the bag into my grandpa's truck. I turn on the light on the outside of the garage and walk to my grandpa's truck. Me being 8 years old at the time, I was afraid of the dark, so I kind of sped walked and I threw the bag and hoped it would make it. However, it did not make it, and I hear the bag land on the ground behind the truck. My head drops and my heart starts to pound for some reason. Like, I know if I go behind the truck, something will get me. You know, the basic 8-year-old paranoia. So I run to the back of the truck, pick up the bag, and toss it inside and turn to go back into the garage, when I see something. The way my driveway is, it turns off a gravel road and curves to the left and up a hill. The hill smooths out a little, but doesn't level off completely. Right where the hill gets less steep, I see a dark figure standing there. In the light coming from the garage, I can just make out its silhouette. It appears to be a person at first, but then my eyes adjust on it, and I can vaguely make out hair covering its entire body. I stand there frozen with fear, like if I turn my back it's going to sprint up and get me. So I hesitantly walk backwards towards the garage while keeping my eyes on it, and it seems that every step I take, it takes one also. I finally reach the hole where the garage door is placed and run as fast as I can inside. When I get inside, I run into the living room for my grandpa and say, "Grandpa, get the gun, there's something in the driveway. It's big and it's walking on 2 feet. I don't know what it is, but it scares me." So my grandpa gets the gun and we go outside on the front porch, which is a good 40 yards closer to the part of the hill I saw it at, and it's not there. My grandpa says, "You sure you saw something?" I don't say anything. I just nod. He drops the gun from his shoulder and says, "Come on. You haven't put a new trash bag in the trash can yet." We both turn around and walk back inside. Several hours go by and nothing else happens, until about 1 a.m. I wake up from having a dream of what I saw. I lay in my bed and looked at my curtain windows, and can see that the front porch light is on. I find that safer because it acts as a sort of nightlight for me. So I'm laying there, looking at my window, when I see a huge shadow walk right in front of my window on the outside. And I mean huge. The window sat about 2 feet off the ground, was about 4 foot tall, and was about 2.5 feet from the ceiling. And this thing was tall enough to cast a shadow big enough to where it looked like someone was sliding a wall past the window. I could hear the boards creaking out on the front porch, and can see how wide this thing was from a side view. This thing, whatever it was at least 2 feet wide from the side. And it was absolutely huge. I didn't want to go and get my grandparents because I didn't want them to get mad for me waking them up at 1 a.m. and for them to come out and see nothing. So I just watched this thing walk back and forth past my window. Before too long, I fell asleep again. Fast forward to the summer between my sophomore and junior year in high school. I had moved off the mountain, but was still going to the same school. Anyway, a week before school got out, me and my best friend Kevin thought it might be a good idea to go up to the mountain and see if we could find what I saw. Without hesitation, I jumped at the opportunity and said, "Hell yeah, let's go." So the following weekend, after school ended, I met up with him and we bought some camping gear along with some food and a rifle. I tell him we can camp out at the house I saw this thing at, and he agreed it was the best place to start. So we make it to the night, and he's like, "Yo, let's go out and walk around." I say okay, and we both get out of the tent. I instantly felt like I was being watched. I shouldered the rifle and felt the adrenaline filling my veins. Kevin puts his hand on the barrel and lowers the end of the gun to the ground. "Don't do that. You'll make me nervous." So we start walking around the woods. We find some small game paths and hear a few noises, but we don't find anything. We both look at each other and decide it's not worth it, so we start walking back to the tent, which will take at least 30 minutes. On our way back, we can hear things in the woods that sounded like tree knocks and whoops. We get about 100 yards from the property we're camping out on, and suddenly a rock flies through the woods and lands within 10 feet of me and Kevin. Then it's like it just unloaded on us. Rocks were landing all around us with not much time between impact. We hear all sorts of whoops and hollers coming from different directions, almost like we were being surrounded. I tell Kevin to run, and I'll be right behind him. We start running towards the property and I hear trees snapping behind us. I stop for a split second, Raise the gun and fire a shot into the air. Then all goes silent. Kevin stops just in the clearing of the property and looks back at me. I look back at him and we both run onto the property and book it out of there as fast as the pickup truck we drove will take us. I haven't been back there since. Story 3. I thought I'd share one of my experiences. I grew up in Oregon. As most Oregonians do, we did a lot of camping. One particular trip, we were at our favorite site on the east side of Hills Creek Reservoir. I don't remember the exact date, but I was probably 14 or 15 years old, so it was around 1999. My tent was fairly close to the water, maybe 40 feet back, while my parents' tent with my younger siblings were about 200 feet further back into the woods. I was maybe 15 feet from the fire, and our kitchen was set up about 30 feet west of me on the raised area. Everyone went to bed, and I stayed up around an hour longer with my dog. We eventually went to bed. I get all cozy, and my dog perks up with alert. I wasn't too worried, as I could hear the frogs and crickets. Then, everything went dead silent. Frogs and crickets stopped. I could hear something coming through the woods from the direction of the lake. It sounded large. I thought maybe it was a bear or deer. My dog starts growling, and I do my best to keep her quiet. The walking sound gets to the raised area of the camp where the kitchen is. I hear some stuff move around. I manage to slowly unzip part of the tent window. It's very dark, not much of a moon, and the fire was dying. But I could vaguely see something. Then, a very large figure steps down from the raised area, about a 4 to 5 foot drop, and walks directly towards my tent. My heart is pounding. Dog starts shaking while growling. Thankfully, not a bark is released. The figure moves past my tent within 5 to 6 feet and makes its way up the road back through the woods with huge, broad steps, each with a deep thump. 10 minutes later, the frogs and crickets come back. Story 4. Recently, I have gone from marginally interested in the topic of Bigfoot to really taking a deep look into this phenomena. For whatever reason, this topic really has captured me. One of the most fascinating things is when you hear a person state after an encounter how these weird little things that they had previously brushed off, an acorn thrown at them, etc., begin to make more sense. Something similar is happening to me, in that 2 separate experiences I've had in my life have started to make much more sense now. What follows is one of those experiences, as the other I have shared previously on another sub. This was around 2007, and at the time I owned a small 3-acre parcel next to the Manistee National Forest in Michigan's Lower Peninsula. I should mention the county in which this took place is easily one of the most rural and remote counties in the Lower Peninsula. The property was seldom visited, so my buddies and I decided to camp there one weekend to check out the fishing nearby. At the time, there were no houses or cabins built around the lot. The property was densely wooded, and so we camped in a small clearing. Pretty uneventful, typical camping, and around 11 p.m. turned in, each in our own tents. Now I have to share I'm an extremely light sleeper, and it's sounds that will wake me up, so it's often hard for me to fall asleep with the normal camping sounds, insects, etc., but I was finally able to. At some time in the night, it was well after midnight, I know that, I remember waking up because all the sounds I fell asleep to were silent. Completely silent. I lay there for a few minutes, half out of it, when I hear footsteps coming in from the woods behind me. They were very definite, but I could tell they were trying to be quiet. They only stayed for a few minutes, walked around my tent, and then walked off. I thought it was one of my buddies going to take a leak, and so I waited for the zipper sound of them getting back into their tent. But it never happened. The next day, having breakfast around the fire, I mentioned the footsteps, and of course no one heard them, and also no one had left their tent that night. We spoke a bit about what it could have been, For myself, I was concerned it was a bear, but they said there was no way a bear would be that quiet, and nothing was touched at the camp. Their consensus was a deer, but I remember saying it sounded two-legged, and not a small-sized foot. It didn't feel like a hoof, but a longer, more sustained footfall. My one friend kindly just said I was no tracker, and it was some animal and to just drop it. And that was it for that day. I dropped it too, just being relieved it was not a bear. Looking back, it's so funny because that one friend who was the most stirred up made some excuse about his 10 leaking and slept in his truck that night. I didn't even question it. That second night, the footsteps came back, did their little cautious lap, and left back into the forest. I swear whatever it was on 2 legs, and the same longer duration footfall sounds. It never occurred to me that it was anything else, that I just misinterpreted the sound of a typical animal. This is the story of my first encounter. In 1974, my parents moved my little brother and I from Greater Detroit all the way up north to the, very at the time, rural town of Elk Rapids. My father brought a small roadside motel, and here my mum made a real go at it. This place was magical for me as a 5-year-old. Snakes, turtles, frogs. All of this natural world was new to me. In looking back, I'm amazed at how much land my parents owned due to them also owning some frontage on Lake Michigan as part of the motel grounds. I mention this due to the fact that the beach itself was set far back, maybe 0.25 miles behind the motel with thick, dense forest in between. I can't stress enough for those of you who are familiar with what this area is like now. In the mid-70s, it was really away from it all. So much so that my dad learned that there was a Native American family living on his land in the forest and that they needed access to the hand well pump in the barn in order to have water, which he gladly allowed to continue. In looking back, it must have been quite an adjustment for he and my mother also. So it was during one of those summer nights, all the windows open, breeze blowing, and the curtains billowing in, that I shot out of bed. Again, I was 5 at the time, and still cannot say what got me up in the middle of the night. It was definitely late, and everyone was sound asleep, and the whole place was dead silent. I remember being frightened, and I remember that I had to get to my parents' room as quickly and quietly as possible. This is where my memory is more acute. I remember that my parents' bedroom window was open. I remember the sheer curtains billowing in the breeze. I stood at the doorway to their room looking at my parents sleeping, then going back to the window. I remember their window faced the courtyard for the motel, and there was light coming from the window, either from the yard lights in the courtyard or the moon. I remember the light so vividly. It was then that someone or something came to the open window and was looking in at me. I could not see its face. It was completely blacked out in silhouette. All I could see was the halo of long hair everywhere, not just its head, all lit up by the light behind it. The sight of it broke me from my spell, and I crossed the room and dove in between my parents. I laid there, being as quiet as possible, knowing that it watched me run across the room. There was no sound. I remember my dad lying on his side like a wall between me and whatever it was at the window. I remember lifting my head to peek over a few times, and each time it was still there, staring in the window. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. That experience was a turning point for me, and not in the best way, because now that I'm 50 years old and I'm no longer embarrassed, from then on, I really struggled to sleep on my own and was always trying to sneak in my parents' bed. Well into grade school, I really dreaded going to bed, even when my brother and I shared a room. Looking back, I wish I would have said something to them about that in the moment, but what would they have done? It was years later as an adult when my cousins asked me to tell them that story again at a family function, that my mother, my father had already passed, overheard and asked me to tell her about it. I could see in her eyes that lots of pieces fell into place. As I write this and think about that moment when I stood at my parents' door watching the window, I realize how I may have been expecting it to appear there. Maybe I saw it at my bedroom window and thought it might follow me, Story 5. I've only shared this experience with a few people in the years since it happened. It was the first Tuesday of the Pennsylvania deer rifle season, December 3rd, 2013. I've always been an avid hunter, and I would wake up very early in the morning to get into the woods before daylight. I would have been in the woods at 4:30 in the morning. Having to hunt on state game lands meant beating other people into the woods to get a decent spot. When I got into the parking area around 4:15 a.m., no one else was there. So I walked into the woods, not using a flashlight, only walking by moonlight. I walked through a field into the tree line and started on the path to my spot. I came to the intersection in the path. One way went left and down the mountain, the other way went right. I went right because my spot was on the other side. Roughly 50 yards after making the right-hand turn, I smelled what I could only describe as hot garbage. It hit me in the face, hot dumpster juice in the middle of August. So I stopped dead, turned on my flashlight expecting to see piles of garbage. Nothing. No garbage. Nothing dead. Just hot garbage smell. Keep in mind this is in December. It's cold out. High 20s to low 30s. So even if there was garbage, it wouldn't smell that bad. So I kind of thought nothing of it. I followed the path to my spot, which was down over the ridge from the garbage smell. Roughly maybe 40 feet down, that leads to a grass field where I would sit. I set up my seat, get settled in for about 2 minutes. That's when the rocks started coming down the ridge. First rock startled me, causing me to turn on my light again, scanning the field hoping to see the eye reflection of a deer, but nothing was there. I sat back down. Another rock comes down the ridge. This time I stand up to go into the grass field with a flashlight and the pistol that I carry while hunting. Scanned again. Nothing. Purposely waited in the field for about 5 minutes. Now I'm getting angry, assuming another hunter is messing with me because I'm in their spot. I sit down again. The third rock, sounding larger than the others, comes tumbling down the ridge. I don't get up this time. Not 2 minutes after that, another rock, not tumbled, but sounded as if it was thrown off the ridge and landed in the field. Now I'm pissed. I gathered up my gear and started back up the trail to the ridge. I get to the top of the ridge, scanning with my light the whole time. Nothing. No eyes. No other hunter. I get to the spot where I smell the hot garbage. Nothing. The smell is gone. Finally, it clicked in my head. It may not have been another person. Possibly something else. I've heard a lot of other stories about people's Bigfoot experiences, a lot of which remark about how bad they smell. Screw this. I all but run out of the woods. And to top it off, no other vehicles were in the parking area when I got out of the woods. This took place in Pennsylvania State, Game Lands 229 outside of Tremont in Schuylkill County. I later come to find out that a co-worker of mine had actually seen a bipedal cross in front of his car within 2 miles of location of my experience. So maybe they're real. I don't know. But I definitely had an experience that I won't forget. Story 6. I've seen a question on here asking about a positive encounter, and I have one I would like to share, though it may not be what I thought. About 20 years ago, after I graduated high school, I used to run traps to make extra money in the wintertime. Since I was pregnant with my daughter, any sort of extra income was necessary, since trapping is frowned upon oddly. Anyway, my father always told me about the creek I trapped in as being quite strange. We would always walk the creek to collect arrowheads and look for other Shawnee relics. So he would always tell me about the Shawnee Native American tribe and their history and folklore. It was a very special spot to us. So when I began trapping, my father would tell me to have respect for the wildlife, don't litter, kill humanely, and don't kill what doesn't need to be killed. So I built a great deal of appreciation to life, which led to my career in conservation. About once a week, while walking up the creek, I would hear whistling, like a human but in random patterns. And that would be along with a smell of sulfur and rotten eggs. To which my dad told me was most likely a Bigfoot or skunk ape, and sightings had occurred as long as he could remember in our area. Then, one time, I was scanning down the tree line with my binoculars to check to see if I had any coyotes and foxes in my traps to save me the walking time. I see a fairly medium-sized tree swaying dramatically a little past the tree line. So, I headed over there with my 2.2, hoping to sneak up on a bobcat or any animal that was medium-sized my 2.2 could kill with a headshot. About a quarter of the way to the tree line, the swaying stopped, and I didn't see anything. But at least two of whatever it was began whistling and whooping further back in the forest. I continued to head up the creek, and it always stays somewhat behind me at a distance but never left. That was fairly interesting. Then one day, sadly, an oil fracking company purchased most of the land. They still gave me permission to trap, but they had a few accidents where the water got so damn nasty it killed just about everything. It broke my heart to see beavers, muskrats, and some raccoons floating down the creek every time I went. But after they had installed their rigs and cleared some forest, things got a little hostile. One day, running traps, almost all of my traps had been ruined, bent, beaten, and broken. The remaining animals I caught were either stolen, ripped from the trap with their foot or leg still attached, and I even found a coyote that had been messed up bad. Fur torn, broken lower jaw, and head beaten in. I felt like this was in retaliation to what the oil company had done, and I was the one being blamed. But this is positive. A few months afterwards, I would go to the store twice a week and buy a variety of apples, pears, and a mixture of meat from carcasses I had skinned, put it in a basket, and leave it in the forest hoping whatever it was would get it before anything else. Sometimes the basket would disappear, but always in 2 days everything was gone. One day I believe it left me a present in return. Next to where I dropped off the basket was about 100+ small sticks stacked very neatly, about 20 acorns and a deer antler. It made me feel very happy. I do hope that I did help this creature out in its very sad moment of its life, though it may have been everything but a Bigfoot or skunk ape, because I never physically saw it, or any tracks in the creek bed, but all of my occurrences happened in the woods along the creek, so I don't really know. So still to this day, 20 years later, I think of it from time to time, and I don't see a reason people should be afraid of them. It was a sad but positive 2 winter seasons with it. Even if it was an animal I didn't recognize, I hoped I helped. Story 7. Hi, my name is Ruben, and I am from Mumbai, India. I first heard about Bigfoot as a kid watching National Geographic. I always knew about Yetis residing in deep Himalayan hills and wondered about any Bigfoots possibly living in India. So, what I am about to tell you was a shocker for me when I heard it. My family had a New Year's Day gathering and all my cousins had come over for lunch. We usually spoke about sports, politics, but that was too boring after a while, so I decided to tell my cousins about unknown creatures like Loch Ness Monster, Dogman, etc. And I started off by telling them about Bigfoot and how the legend of Bigfoot runs wild among Americans and many people throughout the world. I was not prepared for what was going to happen next. My dad and grandpa overheard the conversation and came to my room and stood in utter disbelief that I knew about Bigfoots. And I realized just by looking at their eyes they knew more about it than I had ever read or seen. In utter shock, my dad started telling me about a story of his childhood when he was around 12 years old, along with my grandpa, that he had encountered something which defied belief. I still have tears in my eyes while I write this, as this was a surreal moment for me to know that these creatures do exist here in India as well. On a cold winter's evening around 7 o'clock in 1972, my grandpa and my dad were coming back from church. The road that led to the house had acres of sugarcane farms, with tall bushes on both sides of the road. They were on a 110cc scooter, which could be converted to a bicycle if it ever ran out of fuel, and this came in handy as they lived in the countryside far away from town. While they were passing by a huge banyan tree, something just ran out of the sugarcane farm on the left and crossed the road. This thing was 20 to 25 feet away. My grandpa described it as a huge 8 to 9 foot hairy ape-like creature with dark black fur. The creature was on 2 legs, almost like a gorilla who had learnt to walk like a man. The creature crossed the road in an instant and went to the other side of the road and saw my dad and Grandpa. At that very moment, my dad, out of fear, screamed, looking at this hairy creature with massive pecs and shoulders. This led the creature to run away in the field. The speed at which the creature ran was absolutely shocking, and my granddad knew this low-powered bike wouldn't do any good if the creature decided to pursue them. Thankfully, this creature decided to leave them alone and was never seen again. This was the encounter that changed their life and raised their curiosity in this subject. They never spoke of it in fear of being ridiculed, but when they saw me speak about Bigfoots, they knew they were not alone, and many people in the world had experienced what they had seen. My dad even went on to say about a man he knew who filmed one of these creatures, but never knew what they were called and thought it was some kind of an ape. People in India would generally not know about such cryptids. I saw the truth of the story in my grandpa's eyes, and I've never felt such a strong conviction to tell a story like this. I know this may sound weird, but there are accounts of Bigfoot encounters in deep rural India. I don't know what was the thing that my granddad and dad saw, but I am sure it was certainly not a gorilla walking on 2 feet. Thank you for watching and/or listening to this video. If you enjoyed it, please go ahead and show your appreciation by tapping on the like button. If you're new to my channel and enjoy listening to my narrations, please help my channel to grow by subscribing and hitting the notification bell. I've started a new project for this channel. After releasing storytelling videos, I'm creating an after-discussion podcast about the subject matters with the help of my friend Jim in the UK. My most recent video features us talking about the Hat Man. If this is something you think you'd be interested in hearing, keep a lookout for my next video in which we discuss these Bigfoot stories and Bigfoot in general. Thanks again for listening.